I got some crazy Red Dead Redemption theories for you today. Let's begin. What if there was no rat? Think about it. The Blackwater massacre happened because Dutch impulsively decided to take on an extra heist right after another job. It wasn't Micah or anyone else feeding information to the Pinkertons. It was Dutch abandoning his own careful planning. The gang had successfully pulled off jobs for years before this by being cautious and strategic. But something changed in Dutch, and that change started affecting everyone's judgment. The Valentine bank robbery is another perfect example. The gang literally shot up half the town in broad daylight. They weren't exactly being subtle about their presence in the area, especially after the previous bar fight and other incidents. It's not surprising that law enforcement was able to track them. They were leaving a trail of chaos wherever they went. Looking at the St. Denis bank robbery, it was arguably one of their most foolish moves. They attempted to rob the biggest bank in the biggest city in the region, right after stirring up trouble with the local crime lord. The gang was practically advertising their presence to every law enforcement agency in the state. The Pinkertons didn't need an informant to figure out the gang's location when they were making such obvious moves. The gang's deterioration can be traced through their increasingly desperate and public actions. They went from carefully planned train robberies and small-town schemes to massive shootouts and high-profile heists. Each failed job made them more desperate, leading to even riskier attempts to score big. It's a classic downward spiral, and it all started with Dutch's changing behavior and the gang's blind loyalty to follow him into increasingly dangerous situations. What's particularly tragic is how the gang members rationalized their failures. Instead of recognizing their own mistakes, they became paranoid and started looking for traitors. This paranoia only grew worse after Guarma, creating the perfect environment for Micah to manipulate the situation. The real rat was the gang's own deteriorating judgment, and their refusal to see how their actions were attracting attention. When you look at Cornwall's involvement, it makes perfect sense without any rat theory. The gang repeatedly hit his businesses and properties. Of course, he was going to hire the Pinkertons to hunt them down. They weren't being betrayed. They were facing the logical consequences of targeting a wealthy and powerful man multiple times. The gang didn't need a traitor to fall apart. They were perfectly capable of destroying themselves through pride, desperation, and poor decisions. It makes the story even more poignant because there was no single villain to blame. Instead, we watch good people gradually lose their way, making worse and worse decisions until everything falls apart. The theory that there was no rat before Guarma actually makes the story more impactful. It shows how a group of people who were once careful and successful outlaws could destroy themselves through their own actions, rather than through betrayal. Let me know what you think about this theory in the comments below. Could the gang have survived if they'd stuck to their original careful approach? Next, Red Dead Redemption's mysterious strange man. The idea that he might actually be Cain from the Bible. First, let's talk about how deeply this theory connects to the strange man's apparent immortality. When John Marston shoots him 3 times, the bullets have no effect, something that aligns perfectly with God's promise of protection for Cain. The fact that John ends up being shot approximately 21 times at the end of RDR 1 is particularly chilling when you consider the biblical 7-fold vengeance promised to anyone who would harm Cain. 3 bullets from John, multiplied by 7. The math works out in a way that feels far too precise to be coincidental. The strange man's seemingly infinite knowledge about everyone and everything takes on new meaning when you consider that, if he were Cain, he would have been walking the earth since the very beginning of biblical history. His cryptic responses start making more sense too. When he tells John, "You will be responsible," after being threatened, it's not just a mysterious warning. It's a reference to the divine curse that protects him and ensures vengeance against his attackers. The theory gets even more compelling when you look at the strange man's connection to tumbleweed. The biblical curse on Cain specifically mentions that he won't be able to successfully cultivate the ground, and that he'll be a wanderer. Tumbleweed's abandonment and decay could be seen as a physical manifestation of this curse. Wherever Cain goes, the land itself seems to reject human settlement and growth. That photograph labeling his house as serial killer is particularly fascinating because it creates a direct link to Cain's status as humanity's first murderer. It's almost as if the game itself is leaving us a breadcrumb trail of biblical references. The fact that John recognizes him but can't place from where makes perfect sense too. Cain would be ingrained in humanity's collective memory, recognizable on some primal level even if people can't quite place why. The strange man's famous line, "Yes, many have," in response to being damned, takes on an entirely new level of meaning through this lens. It's not just a clever retort. It's a reference to his eternal punishment, his endless wandering across the earth, damned but unable to die. This interpretation adds layers of tragedy to his character, suggesting he's not just some supernatural entity, but perhaps the original marked man, carrying the weight of the first murder through all of history. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it ties into Red Dead Redemption's broader themes about sin, redemption, and the price of violence. If the strange man is indeed Cain, his presence in the game serves as a warning about the cyclical nature of violence. He's both the first murderer and an eternal witness to all the murders that followed, including those committed by our protagonists. The way this theory weaves together biblical mythology, game mechanics, and narrative themes is genuinely impressive. It explains not just who the strange man is, but why he appears in these specific moments, and why his interactions with John Marston play out the way they do. Now, do RDR 2 has vampires? Let's start with the obvious. Our friend in St. Denis. That creepy little vampire encounter in the back alleys isn't just some random event. This guy literally drinks blood, has supernatural strength, and can only be killed with a specific knife through the heart. Sound familiar? The fact that you can only find him at night and he's got that whole Victorian Gothic vibe going on feels pretty deliberate on Rockstar's part. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if he's not the only vampire? Think about the Aberdeen pig farm siblings. Sure, they seem like your typical creepy hillbilly murderers at first glance, but let's look closer. They don't age between their childhood photos and the present day. They're incredibly strong despite their seemingly inactive lifestyle. They drain their victims of blood before disposing of them. And most tellingly, they can't enter Arthur's room at the inn unless invited, following classic vampire rules. Speaking of classic vampire stuff, let's talk about Armadillo. The whole town is cursed with a mysterious plague that keeps coming back generation after generation. People becoming mysteriously ill, looking pale and drained, classic vampire victim symptoms. And what's especially weird is how some people seem completely immune, while others get sick right away. In vampire lore, some people are naturally resistant to vampire influence. Now here's something really subtle that most players miss: those weird healing properties of St. Denis. Notice how your health core fills up faster at night in St. Denis. The game explains it as night folk remedies. But what if it's actually because there's a vampire presence in the city? In traditional folklore, vampires actually had healing powers they could grant to their followers. The Braithwaite family throws up some interesting vampire red flags too. Catherine Braithwaite's obsession with youth and beauty, the family's mysterious wealth, their tendency to operate at night, and their weird resistance to aging until everything falls apart. It all fits the vampire narrative pretty well. Plus, their mansion burns down way too easily for such a massive structure, almost like they had some supernatural weakness to fire. Even some of the random encounters start looking different through this lens. Those night folk in the swamps? Maybe they're not just crazy people. Maybe they're thralls or vampire servants. It would explain their superhuman strength and their leader's weird ability to take multiple headshots before going down. The pentagram in Butcher Creek gets more interesting too. Everyone assumes it's demonic, but pentagrams were also traditionally used to ward off vampires. The whole town's paranoia about being cursed could actually be their subconscious awareness of vampire activity in the area. Here's another weird detail. Remember how in Van Horn, nobody ever seems to die permanently? You can get in massive shootouts, come back later, and everyone's fine. The town's also suspiciously active at night. Could it be a vampire haven hiding in plain sight? A place where the undead can die and come back without raising suspicion? What makes this theory extra fun is how it fits with the game's themes about the death of the Old West. Just as the traditional Western way of life is dying out, these ancient predators might be making their last stand too, hiding in the dying towns and backwoods as civilization closes in. And let's not forget how this connects to Undead Nightmare from the first game. Maybe that wasn't just a non-canon zombie DLC. Maybe it was hinting at a deeper supernatural undercurrent that's been part of the Red Dead universe all along. Now, why Dutch went insane in later chapters. Think about Dutch's behavior before and after the trolley accident. Before the crash, even though he was showing signs of stress, his decisions still had some logic to them. He was still the calculating leader who could pull off elaborate plans. But after that violent crash where he smashed his head, that's when things start getting really erratic. The medical details here are pretty interesting. Dutch likely suffered what we'd now call a traumatic brain injury. He was thrown hard enough to black out, and if you pay attention to his behavior afterward, he shows classic symptoms: increased aggression, poor impulse control, paranoia, and difficult processing complex situations. Watch his eyes in the cutscenes after the accident. They get this unfocused quality they didn't have before. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it explains Dutch's sudden inability to plan effectively. Before the crash, even his risky plans had some method to them. After, he starts making absolutely bizarre decisions. The Bronte revenge mission is a perfect example. It was tactically nonsensical and purely emotional, something the old Dutch would never have approved. The timing of his personality change is crucial too. People often point to Hosea's death as the moment Dutch lost it, but his behavior was already changing after the trolley crash. Hosea's death might have accelerated things, but the foundation for Dutch's breakdown was already laid when his head hit that trolley wall. His increased paranoia after the accident is particularly telling. Sure, Dutch had always been somewhat suspicious of others, but after the crash, it becomes almost pathological. He starts seeing betrayal everywhere, even from loyal gang members like Arthur, who'd been with him for decades. This kind of extreme paranoia is actually a documented symptom of frontal lobe damage. The way Dutch's speech patterns change is another subtle detail supporting this theory. Early in the game, he's eloquent and persuasive. After the crash, he starts repeating himself more, falling back on the same phrases about faith and loyalty over and over. This kind of repetitive speech can be another sign of brain trauma. Looking at his decision-making in Guarma really drives this home. The old Dutch would never have gotten his men stranded on a foreign island. But post-accident Dutch? He's operating purely on impulse, unable to see the bigger picture or plan ahead like he used to. The way he handles the situation there, stirring up a revolution when they should be lying low, shows how his strategic thinking has been compromised. What's particularly sad about this theory is how it reframes Dutch's relationship with Arthur and John. They keep expecting him to snap out of it, or return to his old self, not realizing that they're dealing with someone who's literally suffered brain damage. They're looking for logic in the actions of someone who might be physically incapable of providing it anymore. Dutch isn't just morally falling, he's literally suffering from a physical injury that's affecting his judgment, and nobody around him has the medical knowledge to understand what's happening. They keep trying to reason with someone whose ability to reason has been fundamentally altered. Even Dutch's famous last words in RDR 1, "I can't fight my own nature," take on new meaning with this theory. Maybe he had moments of clarity where he realized something was wrong with his mind, but he couldn't do anything about it. It wasn't just his nature he was fighting. It was the effects of a serious brain injury. The brilliance of this theory is how it bridges the gap between the Dutch we meet at the start of RDR 2 and the man he becomes. It's not just stress or greed that changes him. There's a specific medical event that triggers his decline, making his transformation feel more grounded and tragic. Zrenia Micah Bell. The idea is that he didn't join the Van der Linde gang for the usual reasons. He was actually after a bounty on either Dutch or Arthur. First, let's talk about Micah's timing. He joined the gang just 6 months before Blackwater, right when the gang was starting to make serious noise in the criminal world. That's also around the time bounties on Dutch would have been getting really juicy. The timing feels less like coincidence and more like calculated planning, especially given how quickly he started pushing for bigger, riskier jobs. Think about Micah's behavior throughout the game. He's constantly trying to isolate Dutch from his most trusted advisors, especially Arthur and Hosea. Classic bounty hunter move: separate the target from their support system. He pushes for jobs that put them in increasingly public positions, making them easier to track. Every suggestion he makes seems designed to make the gang more visible to law enforcement. Here's something interesting. Micah never really tries to integrate with the gang. Most members live in camp, share food, contribute to the community. But Micah? He stays on the outskirts, keeps to himself. doesn't really participate in camp life. It's like he's deliberately maintaining emotional distance because he knows he'll eventually have to turn on these people. His obsession with getting close to Dutch makes more sense through this lens too. If Dutch had the bigger bounty, Micah would need to be near him when the time came to make his move. Remember how he always argued against splitting up the gang, even when it made tactical sense? He needed to keep his target close. The theory gets even more interesting if you consider Arthur might have been the actual target. Think about it. Arthur was Dutch's main enforcer for 20 years. He would have had a serious bounty on his head, and taking him down would have been quite the feather in any bounty hunter's cap. This might explain why Micah was always trying to antagonize Arthur, pushing him to make mistakes or break away from the gang. Micah's shooting style is another subtle clue. He's too skilled to be just another outlaw. His technique is more refined, more professional. Exactly what you'd expect from someone who makes their living bringing in dangerous criminals. The way he handles himself in gunfights suggests formal training rather than just street experience. The fact that Micah keeps detailed newspaper clippings about the gang is pretty suspicious too. Sure, he plays it off as vanity, but it looks an awful lot like someone building a case file. Notice how he's particularly interested in articles about Dutch and Arthur's exploits? Almost like he's tracking their movements and patterns. His connections with law enforcement become clear pretty quickly after Guarma. But what if those weren't new relationships? What if he'd been working with them all along, just waiting for the right moment to cash in? It would explain why he was so ready to flip when the opportunity came. He'd been planning it from the start. Even Micah's personality might have been part of the act. He plays up the cruel, unstable outlaw angle so much it almost feels performative. Maybe that was intentional, making himself seem like just another psychotic gang member while he waited for his chance. The fact that he's actually quite calculating and patient under his wild exterior supports this idea. Looking at the ending through this lens makes it even more interesting. When Dutch shows up at that mountain, maybe Micah wasn't just trying to save his skin. Maybe he was making one last attempt to collect his original bounty. It would explain why he seems more frustrated than scared in those final moments. Next theory about Mary-Beth Gaskell, the idea that she might actually be the missing Luxembourg princess. You know, the one from that mysterious poster in Van Horn? First, let's talk about the timeline. The princess went missing 15 years before RDR 2's events, which would put Mary-Beth at the right age. She mentions being taken in by the gang when she was very young, but her early memories are suspiciously vague. Interestingly, she always seems more educated and refined than your typical outlaw, even though she supposedly grew up as a pickpocket on the streets. Pay attention to Mary-Beth's mannerisms throughout the game. Despite living with a gang of outlaws, she carries herself differently. Her posture, her way of speaking, her love of literature and writing, these aren't things you typically pick up living rough. It's almost like she had some kind of formal training early in life that she can't quite shake off. The princess mystery has another interesting connection: the birthmark shaped like a lion. While we never see Mary-Beth's birthmark in game, there are several subtle hints about her always keeping her left shoulder covered. Watch her outfits throughout the game. They consistently hide that specific area, which could be more than just a coincidence. Mary-Beth's relationship with Dutch is particularly interesting through this lens. He treats her differently from other gang members, almost protectively. Could it be that Dutch, who loves to style himself as a sophisticated revolutionary, recognized something royal in the young girl he took in? It would explain why he encouraged her reading and writing instead of pushing her into more typical gang activities. Her writing talents take on new meaning with this theory too. Mary-Beth doesn't just write. She writes romance novels about aristocrats and high society. For someone who supposedly grew up on the streets, she has an unusually detailed knowledge of upper-class life. Maybe these aren't just stories from her imagination, but distant memories resurfacing. The way other gang members interact with Mary-Beth is telling too. Everyone treats her as somehow different, special. Even the roughest characters in camp soften around her. There's this unspoken understanding that she doesn't belong in their world. Not really. Even Grimshaw, who's harsh with the other girls, shows a certain deference to Mary-Beth. Her pickpocketing background actually supports this theory in an interesting way. Who better to teach a lost princess to survive than pickpockets and thieves? It's almost like something out of a fairy tale. The lost princess taken in by outlaws, learning to survive while retaining hints of her noble nature. The theory gets even more interesting when you look at Mary-Beth's eventual fate. She becomes a successful author, writing under a pen name. Think about it. If you were a hidden princess who couldn't reclaim your throne, wouldn't becoming a novelist be a perfect way to live out your romantic ideals while maintaining your anonymity? There's also something poetic about how she's one of the few gang members who successfully escapes to a better life. Maybe this isn't just good luck. Maybe some part of her remembered who she was and helped her aim higher than the outlaw life. And we are done. What do you think of these theories? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.